Hey everyone, this is Will from Beijing, China, and welcome to this brand new and exciting episode of The Missing Piece. Under this globalization, every country today on the map is seeking ways to what we called making noises. Some of the countries are quite significant. Others are still struggling not only politically but also economically. Across the globe, that you might have realized how the younger generations across the world are not only pushing this political agenda, but also they're actively engaging the social and cultural wars as well. So that's why it's so interesting. In this episode, I want to focus on one of the largest countries in Asia, India. When we talk about India, not only that most people can come up with the number of the population, which is rather competitive with the neighboring countries, but also throughout the years, we have to say, or today we have to admit, how the younger generations, especially the contemporary millennials today, they are changing not only the society, but also some of the creative and innovative ideas are also came out recently. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's our great honor to have Snigdha Poonan all the way from India, and she's a journalist and a writer based in India. And she reported on national affairs for the Hindustan Times, and also her articles appears in multiple credible journalist resources. For example, New York Times, The Guardian, and the Foreign Policy. And most importantly, she recently came out with a new book entitled Dreamers: How Young Indians Are Changing the World. Snigdha, welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. It's so exciting finally to connect with a real journalist all the way from India. Now, let's get to the questions. My first question is, how would you describe the younger generations today in India? And are they being traditional or they are being more westernized, given this condition that more countries today seem to head to this direction of internationalism? How would you describe them? And what are the reasons led to such change or phenomenon?
Sure. I mean, if there's one word that I could use to describe, millions of young people that we have in India, it would be anxious. In not just in a bad way, but in a good way too. In every way that I could think of, to define themselves in a country and a world that is changing so fast. And they want to find their place in it. They are eager to find India's place in the world and to make an impact in their own country, for India to have an impact in the world and for their lives to change for the better. For the longest time, I mean, Indians have seen themselves or considered themselves like the Chinese as traditional. That was very much true until, my parents' generation. But, things started to change quite rapidly since the 90s. And the generation that's growing up today or that has come of age today sees itself in a conflicted mode. Their cultural values are still very traditional. We are a very family-oriented society still. People have arranged marriages. They respect their parents to a large degree. They have like traditional jobs. They have very traditional views on gender and sexuality and religion. But at the same time, they are much more exposed to the world today than people ever were in the past. It's if my generation and my parents' generation only had television, they have grown up interacting with the world on social media, so they have very expanded ideas of what it means to be successful and influential, and this even materially things that you should have in order for your life to be worthy. So So they are very ambitious. They're very aspirational in terms of like their lifestyles and their income expectations. But they are culturally very traditional.
Snigdha, you mentioned a lot of amazing points. Before we talk about your parents' generation, I want to focus on the younger generations. Let's get a little bit deeper because we know that country as India or the neighboring countries like China, the system or the societal system is becoming more complex than ever. And of course, we know not only because every single country it's becoming more internationalized, but also the younger generations today, they tend to be more innovative, or they tend to, if I can use the phrase called think outside the box. So how do you think the younger generations today in India are actually balancing this tradition and modernity? It seems it's really challenging how to be innovative, but meanwhile, I don't want to, or those people, they refuse to lose the value of the traditional treasure or the concept at the same time. How do you think that younger generations in India today are actually balancing these two relationships?
You made some really good points in the question itself. A lot of them hold very true for India. I mean, the society is changing very rapidly. And if I could describe very quickly, the movement from the villages to the cities is, at a pace that's just unprecedented. So suddenly you have these millions of people leaving their villages, their small towns, and coming to the big cities to work, to make a new life for themselves. If their fathers and their grandfathers worked on the farms and had a very rural lifestyle, suddenly they are supposed to, pass school or college, and pass university and get a job in a factory or an office or at a government, with the government. Except that the jobs. I mean, we don't have that many jobs for them. Millions of people are entering the job market in India every month, but or every year. But the jobs that the government and the private sector are able to create are still very few. So there for the last few years, let's say the last like 10 years, there's been in India this like growing hustle culture, which I mean you can call it the thinking out of box or being innovative, but that innovation and the sense of we must find a way to be successful or to carve out a path is coming from that hustle culture, because the straightforward paths just do not exist for the majority of young Indians. And that's what my book is about. And how do you when every second or third person is so ambitious, what are the ways in which then they will try to carve their own paths, and where will that lead the whole country, and how those actions of so many millions of people will have an impact on the world, in like I said, and you read the book partly in good ways and bad ways.
Now, because we are thinking about this innovation, or we are thinking about technological advancement, when we again address the issue by calling think outside the box, let me give you one example. For example, in China, there seems to be a brand new type of culture, and the culture is called entrepreneurial culture. So in other words, this country, it's actually making greater efforts pushing the younger generations to be entrepreneurs. Even though we know, as you mentioned, probably in India, the job markets are rather competitive, and everyone would like to get a taste of this, icing on the cake. But however, it's fair to say that being entrepreneurs today, not only in China, but I believe also in India, it can be also competitive as well. So that's only one of the unique characters to describe the younger generations in China. So, Stigha, from your perspective, what are some of the unique characters of the millennials today? And I'm sure that you might have already covered in your book, but if I ask you to distinctively name some of the unique characters of millennials today in India, what are some of the names or some of the descriptions that you can share with us?
Sure. One of the things that is common to many of them is that they put a they put their faith in the tech in a way that can be both very hopeful and kind of extreme. And it's because of the various factors that I've described earlier. India is one of the world's like largest user base for most tech companies. More than 500 million people use the internet, smartphones. You'll see youngsters everywhere trying to make something out of mobile phone access, try to create a business out of an app, or trying to become a creator, or trying to, just launch a startup just from their phones. So that's something that I came across quite often, and some parts of the book are dedicated to that, and how that journey can end, for some of them. Like I said earlier, I believe that the millennials in India are still very attached to the cultural values of family being the center of their universe. We're still a very religious society. Like even though things are changing, like I said, there's this great shift going on where people are just constantly moving from the villages and small cities to the bigger centers. So they have to catch up very quickly. So that there's a lot of like tension between what they expect their lives to be and what they find the realities to be around them. And so every day they are sort of negotiating those tensions and those contradictions.
I know you might have answered that question already throughout our conversations, but I always asked each guest, especially authors across the field, the cliche or the traditional way to open up the conversation is, why did you decide to write a book? It's called Dreamers: How the Young Indians Are Changing the World. Because let me just be honest with you. Changing the world, that is such a bold statement. Because for years that I have traveled from countries to countries and I have met younger generations, you could say in Great Britain, you could say in Egypt, or maybe in other countries in Southeast Asia, they're all trying not only just to change themselves, but maybe change within the countries. But you are so bold enough to say how the young Indians are actually changing the world. If I may ask that question, isn't that a little bit too exaggerated? What is your intention to write this book, and why would you name it this way?
Thank you. That is a great question, and I get asked that a lot, and in the same way. And I also love to answer it in whatever way that I can. I wrote this book because India is one of the world's youngest country, and like China, we have such an overwhelming population of young people, and this demographic dividend was supposed to really launch India into the world as a superpower. And I don't know if you even know this, but at the beginning of the millennium, when there was a lot of global discussion on what will be the emerging countries of the future, India was seen as one of them, and the fact that its demographic dividend was just going to explode was seen as its core power. And so as a journalist, when I started to work in Delhi, I saw the word being tossed around a lot. But then I also felt that people didn't understand what that meant. Politicians, corporate leaders, tech companies. They all use this word, but no one was going out to understand what the young people were doing, thinking, wanting, etc. So that's why I wrote this book. Why the title? I believe that, like I said, I mean, India has about 600 million people that are, under the age of 25 or even 35, 30, if you put it broadly. And, youth are linked to change. They have been throughout history. So their actions lead to, shape the future, and not just of their own, place of birth, but we're living in a globalized world, as you said, while launching the podcast, right? So if you have 500 million people in India going in one direction, there will be an impact on the world of their actions. So, I mean, of course, I answer this question elaborately in the book, but, the way that their actions from voting to protesting is shaping democracy, from the way that their actions are shaping what the future of tech will be. Because, like I said, I mean, India has one of the biggest user bases of internet companies in the world. So, whether it's future of democracy or technology, and I'm keeping it short because it's a brief podcast. These their actions and their views, their politics and ideology, they choose a lead. They've chosen a leader twice now who is seen as the leader of the world's largest democracy, right? It is an overwhelmingly young vote. If they choose a leader who's seen to lead the world's largest democracy, it is a message that's going out to the world, whether it's good or bad. And the world today, the Democracy Summit it's still wrapped up. So he is their representative. He is a representative of the world's largest democracy, chosen by the youth. So just to keep it short, there are the number of ways in which I see the actions and beliefs of Indian youth are shaping the world, and Chinese youth, and I think youth everywhere. So that's why the title of the book.
That's a great way to really analyze. But again, we are going to talk a little bit more regarding the leader in India today. But right this moment, I still wanted to focus on the younger generations. Again, you're right, because every single country, the millennials, they are becoming more open-minded because they're exposed to social media and they're exposed to a lot more informations. Not only help them to think differently, but also challenge them to be more creative and to be more innovative in terms of career, in terms of lifestyle. But meanwhile, a lot more countries today, they are giving the younger generations a platform to begin to shape or gradually to turn into the country that they want to live. So let's shift back to India. How do you think, or the question is, where do you think the millennials in India today are thinking about the future of the country? I mean, ultimately, maybe this question it's too big, but I still want to ask is, how do you think the younger generations to perceive the future direction for this country? Is it really heading to, again, you call it westernization, or you call it globalization, or they should keep the country as it is today, but only with Western ideas, or only globalized this type of a format? What do you think?
The young people, the millennials of India today, they do have a lot of views on where they want the country to go. And obviously, not everyone thinks the same way, but I'm talking about a majority of people. And they are extremely curious about where it's going economically. I use the word anxious in answer to your first question, and I'll repeat it. They are very anxious about the country's economic growth. I've written about this a little bit, but and it's really strikes me as really fascinating how many of them just like keep posting on the internet questions about when will India match China in economic growth or GDP or like blah blah blah, like 12 other pointers, and that gives you a sense of how competitive they are in terms of where their country is going versus where countries that were but they countries that they thought of as being similar to them have reached. They have very similar, like they look up to the US a lot in terms of just like economic prosperity, about freedom of expression, about quality of life, and they want India to like slowly make its way to that kind of prosperity also. So there is that. Um, Politically, they are very vocal as well, and for since the 90s, India has been on this globalization trajectory, and it was more or less kind of going straightforward. But then, in the last 8 or 9, whatever, 10 years, there's been like a lot of like political upheavals. And there's been, there's somehow like the direction of where the country should go politically, culturally is being shaped by the current establishment. And that direction is inward rather than outward. And it's like too brief a podcast to go into that, but and because the establishment has an overwhelming support of the youth, they seem to believe too that it is probably better for India economically, culturally, to turn more inwards now. And to like be self-reliant, to take pride in our own systems, our own capabilities, that sort of stuff. So I don't know I don't know where this will go in the future, if India will keep on the path to globalization further, or the way that things are going, we will turn more inward, in the way that many societies have turned. So it's a really curious time and a time of great churn.
Of course, you're right. I 100% agree with you. This is the age of unknown. Again, not to repeat what I said before, but under this age of globalization, it's rather difficult and more challenging to know where each country is heading towards the future. But let's talk about the next part, leadership. We know Narendra Modi made the news headlines quite often these days. And as you mentioned, not only that in terms of this leadership style with the Western leaders today, but also with the neighboring countries such as China and Russia, all those countries. Now, without being so political, I want you to talk about how would you describe Narendra Modi and his leadership today from your perspective as a journalist and as someone who actually stood on the side of the younger generations to evaluate this person. What can you say about him and his leadership style today?
As a leader, he's seen by Indians to be strong and authoritative. And you can interpret that in any way that you like. But this leadership style is not new for India. We've had leaders in the past who were also seen as very strong and authoritative, but he also combines with it the kind of like popular mass support that any political leader hasn't seen in the country's recent past. So that makes him a very striking political force, because he has the majority in parliament. People like in the last, this is the second term, and coming back to power, the his party won even more votes than the last time. So like the people seem to have really put their faith back in him. So he enjoys that kind of validation, but he also uses that validation to push for just his way. And for a country of India's size, where we have so, like in China, we have so many regions, we have so many, so much diversity in what people want for their region, or what see in their best interest based on where they live, what language they speak, what businesses they are engaged in. So it's seen as a little bit problematic that he sets the agenda, because we're not it's still a democracy, and he is the leader of the whole parliament, and more than 500 MPs. But so his leadership style is seen both as problematic by his critics and by his supporters, especially the Indian youth, who in survey after survey share their preference for a strong leader. So by them, he's seen as his leadership style is seen as good, something that is desirable. So that's the contradiction.
I think Modi, that if I'm not mistaken, that he actually was the first few leaders when former US President Donald Trump was elected. He was the few leaders actually congratulated this leader, and he was invited to meet with the former US president. But meanwhile, almost at the same time that US and China, two countries, were caught in the trade war, and every single country, especially in Asia, were looking for ways either to maybe a peacemaker or maybe to be a mediator. But meanwhile, I think India was actually, correct me if I'm wrong, that was actually caught in the middle. Because it was really difficult to balance the relationship between Modi with the US and also US with China. But again, from your journalistic perspective, would you say Modi was the type of person that more focused on solution based, or it's more about to say, how may I describe it fairly? I am going to make sure that I don't get myself caught in the middle of the tension, so that I am not going to lose the partnership with neither of the side. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that the first part of your question is very accurate. That's what happened with the US, India, and China triangle. When India was trying to be, in the US's good books, but also not lose its sort of trade relationship with China. China is India's number one business partner. But I don't think that, as far as India's foreign policy goes, and I know that I described him as a very strong and authoritative leader. India's foreign policy is more complicated and is guided by several other factors as well. In terms of Modi's leadership style, I would say that he is a man who he's believed to make his decisions himself, and to really sort of he expects like everyone under him to follow his decision just word by word. That has been his style for 7 years now, and it's quite well known. This is a person, a prime minister, who's not allowed a single press conference. So it's not, he's not a leader who likes to be questioned or being corrected, or likes to have wide-ranging discussions or anything. A lot of controversial laws in India, you can read up on them, so that I'm not being judgmental, have been passed by you know, just because like the prime minister or people very close to him were interested in passing those laws for their political gains. So like the India's democratic system is not the strongest that it could be right now, and a lot of that is attributed to his leadership style.
But I want to know, how does his personality actually fit into this fast developed country? Again, let's go back to the younger generations. I think today, if I'm not mistaken, the millennials, that they are looking for someone who can bring them or elevate the country to the next level. Granted that maybe this person who doesn't enjoy all the criticism, or maybe this person who refuse, or maybe refuse is not the right word, but the person who prefers not to be put on the negative side, because ultimately he need to care his image, or he care his how the public perceive this person. But so that's why the question is, how do you think that Modi today it's fitting into the younger generation's narration? Would you say he's getting more challenged by the youth, or he's actually someone the millennials are exactly looking for?
Well, there is a vast majority of young Indians who are still very attracted to him, and will not ever blame him for anything. In that, their extreme loyalty lies with him. And you're right that Modi was seen as an icon for India's development, for the hopes of India sort of, launching into superpower status after so many delays. And that is how he pitched himself in the first election in 2014. And there was a lot of buzz around how, there would be so many reforms, and he'll completely sort of change how corporate sector works, how the job market works, how social security works. But it's been 7 years since, and I think that the youth are attracted to him, but at the same time, they're not stupid. So they can see that their lives have not changed. That they're no better today than they were 7 years ago when they were so desperate for change. And yet, many of them still put their faith in him. And I don't think that he only stands for modernity and development. He also stands for something that you shouldn't take lightly. He stands for, this cultural movement that has been going on in India under his government, and the right wing establishment that he belongs to for several decades. And that is to make India more ethnically homogenous, for to make it less diverse in terms of how power is distributed amongst people of various communities, religions. So, and I spoke earlier about how there is, this project to turn India inward is also being seen as tied to his party and his government. So, and those movements have a strong support from within the youth, and who I described as very traditional. So I don't know if I'm being clear. So whether or not he can fulfill those promises of turning India around, of making it an economic superpower, he will, to a large degree, still have the support of Indian millennials, because they are not only thinking in terms of the country's prosperity or their own ambitions, but they're also thinking of how they want the country to be culturally.
Okay. I got two more questions before letting you go. I know your time is very precious. Now, your book, it's actually being translated into different languages, including Chinese. And so that's why we were able to connect with each other. And while I was reading your first book in Chinese, which is quite phenomenal, and I'm sure that a lot more readers would like to know, what are you trying to let readers outside India to understand your book? Because, again, granted, a lot of times when we are reading the author internationally, I think at the end of the book, personally speaking, I always ask the question is, I think this is the point that the author wants us to understand, or I think this is the core or the value that the author wrote this book at the first place. So the next question to you is, Snigdha, for your book to be translated into different languages internationally, what do you want readers outside India to understand or to take away from your book?
Thank you. That's a great question. I hope that, I mean, the book is in a lot of foreign markets by now, the US, the UK, and now in China. And I hope it reaches more markets. And in each of these markets, I hope that the readers will have different perception. In the US and the UK, also known as the West, there's been this perception of India that is very static. People think when I go abroad or I have an opportunity to talk in the US or the UK, people still think that India is a country of temples and Taj Mahal and millions of poor people living on the streets, but it's much more than that. And we have, like I said, we have so many tensions going on. The culture is changing so rapidly. The politics is changing so rapidly. There's so much promise attached to tech in India, and all of these things I will have an impact on the whole world. And so I want their view of India to be shaken by this book. From China, I'll have very different expectations because, again, it's a country of overwhelmingly young people. Again, some of the shifts like rural to urban, or from farming-based lifestyles to very urban, professional-based lifestyles. The tensions with the West, etc. This desire to define themselves, etc. These are common struggles. So, and I already believe that there have been so many discussions amongst the Chinese youth after a couple of extracts were published, and they were both amused by how Indian millennials think and live to some extent, and found resonances. And so I think that it will be. I hope that the reactions will be very different in China. Reactions will be very different in parts of Africa, which are still emerging. Like in the case of India, they also bank on their demographic dividend. They also have democracies that are kind of sometimes work, sometimes don't work. So, I believe that the book was published in parts of Africa. It will have that kind of reaction. So, I'm really happy that the book is reaching different markets, and the perception can't be the same.
Well, I mean, again, as I mentioned before, and I always say this to all the guests, if you ever get the chance to travel to Beijing, China, and please let us know, and we would love to host you, and we would love to show you around, especially provide the opportunities for you to engage with the millennials in China and across the countries. With that said, Snigdha Putman is a journalist and a writer based in India, and she has reported on national affairs for multiple credible journalist resources. And of course, I strongly encourage everyone to check out her latest book. It's called Dreamers: How Young Indians Are Changing the World. And this book actually can be found on Amazon, and also currently it's already translated into Chinese and in the market as well. So again, thank you so much for taking your time, and thank you so much for sharing your insight with us.